You know, it's my favorite thing about eschatology, or the study of last things. It comes from the Greek word eschaton, which means last things. It's a neuter noun, and then logos, which is discourse. It's a discourse of last things. That the primary thing, especially in Canada and the United States, is what we call premillennialism. And a lot of times pre-trib premillennialism, which means Jesus is going to come back, there's a secret rapture, 3 years of tribulation, and then the Antichrist appears in that time, sometimes 7 years, and then Christ comes back, destroys the Antichrist, the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and then another rising up. That's the most prevalent view in Canada and the United States.
Haven't you listened to Left Behind series?
Left Behind series. The only thing Left Behind and Left Behind series was the Bible. But what's funny is that view is not held hardly at all throughout church history. And you look at the book of Revelation. I know guys who could sit here in this table right now and argue with you and make you look so dumb. They could sit down and argue the point that the entire book of Revelation is already fulfilled, except for the last couple chapters. That the whole thing was fulfilled in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of Rome. And so when we talk about last things, you know, the idea of the secret rapture, no one believed in that. The whole thing of last things is there's so much stuff out there and goofy stuff that it's the one thing that we have to put our focus on is that we are to be ready when Christ returns. We are to be ready. One of the things that's interesting though is if I had to put my finger on what was going to happen, I would say this, that at any moment, even now, a trumpet could blow. You see, Paul the Apostle believed that. So the imminent return of Christ that could happen at any moment without a temple being built or anything else like that. But the whole idea is this. When John the Baptist came to Jerusalem, he said, make every low place high and every high place low and prepare a path for the Lord. In Oriental culture, what that meant was a king could conquer a city or a domain, and then he would put his people in charge, and he may leave for 20, 30 years and never come back. But when he came back, what he would do is he would stand outside the city, and then he would send in emissaries, he would send in loyalists, who while they were coming toward the city, they would tell all the people outside the city to prepare a path. The king was coming. And what would happen was when they made that announcement at the city gates, all the loyalists to the king would come out. And as they came out, they would prepare the way for the king. And then as soon as they arrived with the king would come back in. He knew who his people were. He knew the loyalists because they came out to him. And the others he would crush as insurrectionists and rebels. And I believe that's exactly what will happen. That Christ, a trumpet will blow, the dead in Christ will rise in a fraction of a second. Before the living can even go, wow, what's that? They will be transformed and taken with Christ. The moment we meet Him in the air, I believe that the whole thing will turn and Christ will come back. At that very moment. And we with Him. And the judgment of the nations. And that's an amazing thing. Could happen just like that. And the whole thing of the Antichrist and everything is very, very difficult. I think there is no doubt that the believers will go through whatever tribulation that there is. I don't see any grounds for believers being taken out, nor do most scholars. Like if you were to ask the Chinese today about, do you think we'll pass through the tribulation? They would say, we've been passing through it for 80 years. If a man of lawlessness is to appear, I think that would happen prior to the coming of Christ. And but it's very, very uncertain because the emperor in his name actually can count in Latin 666, the Emperor of Rome. And so you're wondering, who was John speaking about? If that's all we had was the book of Revelation, I would say it was a done deal. But you come to 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians, and it seems to be something very, very future. But one of the things that I think lends to the fact that we are living in something of end. See, the church has been, we've been in the last days for 2,000 years. They began, according to Peter, they began on the day of Pentecost with the coming of the Messiah. We entered into the Messianic age. We've been in the last days. He quotes Joel, and he says, Joel says, in the last days I will pour out my Spirit. But what really bothers me today is that if you look at the Tower of Babel, the world was continuing on until it became united. It became united. And there's something very important. With the Tower of Babel, nation states were formed. Okay? And those nation states were separated by language. Now, there was so much wisdom and grace in God doing that, because it's always been that if one nation became corrupt, it was corrupt in itself. It wasn't that its corruption bled over into other nation states. They were like separate entities, almost like if my arm is cancerous, a doctor cuts off my arm, even though the arm's destroyed, the rest of my body is saved. That's why the Tower of Babel was destroyed. It brought everybody together in united force against God, so that all of society would have to be destroyed, just like in the time of Noah. When the sons of God and the daughters of men came together, which maybe was the line of Seth and the line of Cain, they came together. There was no longer a godly line, and the world was destroyed. So he gets them out. Noah comes out. Then there's this Tower of Babel that goes on. It's basically doing the same thing. There's no godly line left. So you bring all the nations together, or there weren't nations, just one people. The Tower of Babel. Evil is going to be rampant. It's going to require another flood, another destruction of some sort. God shows mercy and He divides them. The problem is today we see the ending of the results of the Tower of Babel. If Hollywood says something tomorrow morning, it will be in some remote place in the Philippines by the afternoon. And the collective depravity. I mean, you can't point to one nation state right now where it's flourishing in godliness and separated from the poison that's in our culture. It's just all amassing and growing and growing and growing. And that's what makes me think that there will either something that will break this again, which it would almost have to be the loss of all technology. Something would break this again, or it's the coming of Christ. And the Chinese believers have a really neat perspective. Very few people know this, but one of the greatest commitments of the Chinese church is to make its way back to Jerusalem. It's an amazing, amazing thing. They say the Americans, the Westerners cannot do it. They do not have the strength. The Christians are weak. They're afraid to die. They love their stuff. And they say, we believe that the gospel has to come back to Jerusalem and through the Muslims. And since we've been trained in martyrdom and trained in suffering for 100 years, this doesn't cause us to fear. It's amazing when you look at some of the other countries, the way they look at what must be done. It's astounding.